DeAndre Brooks was 42 years old, a civil engineer who built his life the same way he built everything else, carefully, precisely, and without shortcuts. He owned a 4-bedroom home in East Memphis that had tripled in value. He had a career, a reputation, and a marriage he believed was solid. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, he came home early from a job site to check a routine invoice and discovered his checking account held $214, not $21,400, $214. He pulled up the transaction history and sat completely still. Over 14 months, $127,000 had been moved out of their accounts in amounts carefully sized to avoid detection. And that was only what he could see from the first screen. His wife had dressed up that morning, kissed him goodbye, and walked out the door. She had no idea he'd come home early. She had no idea what he'd just found, and she had absolutely no idea who she had spent 9 years underestimating. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The warm Memphis sun filtered through the truck's windshield as DeAndre Brooks guided his vehicle down the familiar streets toward home. The worn leather seat creaked beneath him, comfortable from years of use, while rolled blueprints rattled softly in the back with each turn. His mind wandered to the home repair invoice he needed to verify, a simple task that had brought him home early for the first time in months. Numbers and measurements filled his thoughts as he drove, the way they always did. Every building, every structure he passed represented calculations and load-bearing equations to him. The old oak trees lining his street had their own mathematical beauty, the way their branches spread in precise angles, supporting their own weight through decades of growth. He pulled into the driveway of his East Memphis home, a 4-bedroom he'd purchased before the neighborhood became desirable. The property value had tripled since then, a fact that brought him quiet satisfaction. Not that he'd ever boast about it. That wasn't his way. The house stood solid and well-maintained, its brick facade weathered but dignified. DeAndre collected his laptop bag and climbed out of the truck, his work boots crunching on the gravel. The afternoon light cast long shadows across the lawn he'd mowed just 2 days ago. The sound of heels clicking on hardwood greeted him as he entered through the front door. Crystal stood in the living room, perfectly made up, wearing a fitted dress that probably cost more than his best suit. Her expression flickered with something: surprise, annoyance, before settling into a practiced smile. "You're home early," she said, adjusting an expensive earring. Her tone carried a note of accusation beneath the sweetness. "Job site inspection wrapped up ahead of schedule," DeAndre replied evenly, setting his laptop bag on the entryway table. He noted how she shifted her weight, checking her phone with deliberate casualness. "I was just heading out to lunch with the girls," Crystal said, gathering her designer purse. "You know how Melissa gets if anyone's late." She moved toward the door with swift determination, her heels sharp against the floor. "Have a good time," DeAndre offered, watching as she hurried past him. A cloud of expensive perfume lingered in her wake. The door closed behind her with a decisive click. DeAndre stood motionless for a moment, listening to her car start up and pull away. The house settled into silence around him. He moved to the kitchen, his boots quiet now on the hardwood. The island's granite counter caught the afternoon light as he settled onto a bar stool and opened his laptop. The home repair invoice needed verification, a simple task that would take just a moment. His banking website loaded, familiar and orderly. But the numbers that appeared on the screen were wrong. They had to be wrong. DeAndre stared at the balance displayed, $214,337. He drew a slow, measured breath, the kind of breath he'd take before examining a compromised support beam. His fingers moved deliberately across the keyboard, pulling up the transaction history. The story told by those transactions was precise and methodical. Transfer after transfer, spanning 14 months. Never round numbers. 4,867, 882, 3,892, 15, 5,234, 91 arms. Always carefully spaced, never close enough together to trigger automated warnings. A pattern emerged with engineers' clarity. $127,400 systematically drained from their accounts. This wasn't impulsive spending. This wasn't poor financial management. This was architecture. DeAndre sat perfectly still, the way he would on a job site after discovering a critical structural flaw. His breathing remained steady. His expression didn't change. The afternoon light continued its slow crawl across the granite countertop as he absorbed what he was seeing. He didn't reach for his phone. He didn't call Crystal. He didn't allow himself the luxury of reaction. Instead, he closed the laptop with deliberate care. For a long moment, he stayed motionless, looking out the kitchen window at the well-tended backyard. The oak tree's shadow had shifted slightly, marking time's passage with geometric precision. Finally, he reached for his briefcase and removed a fresh legal pad, the yellow kind he used for project notes. The paper made a crisp sound as he laid it flat on the granite surface. With the same steady hand he used for engineering drawings, DeAndre uncapped his pen and drew a single, straight line down the center of the first page. The house grew quiet as night settled in. DeAndre moved methodically through each room, gathering every financial document they owned. Tax returns from the filing cabinet in his home office. Bank statements from Crystal's organization system in the kitchen. Credit card bills she'd tucked away in her vanity drawer. The home equity paperwork from the safe in their closet. The line of credit she'd convinced him to co-sign 18 months ago. He spread everything across the dining room table, the surface disappearing beneath a landscape of papers. The overhead light cast harsh shadows as he began his inventory, treating each document with the same precise attention he gave to engineering specifications. The story told by those papers was even worse than the online transactions had suggested. Crystal had moved money in 3 directions: her personal account, a joint account he'd never heard of, and cash withdrawals timed to his out-of-town work trips. The pattern stretched back further than he'd initially discovered. DeAndre documented everything in his precise engineer's handwriting, filling the legal pad with columns of dates and amounts. His hand remained steady even as the numbers grew. He worked like he was examining a compromised foundation. No emotion, just careful assessment of structural damage. When he found the name D. Farrell on bank transfers, he paused. The dining room's silence felt heavier as he opened his laptop and typed the name into Google. The search results painted a clear picture. Dominic Farrell, real estate developer. The man's LinkedIn profile showed him standing confidently in front of a new construction project, his smile practiced and polished. DeAndre studied that smile for a long moment, his face betraying nothing. Then he returned to the documents, moving through them with renewed focus. The home equity line of credit paperwork revealed the deepest betrayal. The HELOC had been maxed out 8 months ago, $85,000 drawn down in carefully spaced increments. Each draw request bore Crystal's flowing signature, but it was the notary section that made DeAndre's hand pause. There, in clear black ink, was Virginia Whitfield's name and notary stamp. Crystal's mother hadn't just known about the scheme. She'd actively participated in it, lending her notary credentials to facilitate the fraud. The same woman who'd spent 9 years treating him with barely concealed disdain had helped her daughter steal from him. DeAndre sat back in his chair, letting this new information settle. The dining room clock ticked steadily, marking time as he processed what he'd discovered. His discipline held. No outburst, no visible reaction, just the quiet absorption of facts. At 11 p.m., he picked up his phone and called Tanya Ellison. They'd been friends for 20 years, since they were both starting their careers. She answered on the second ring, her voice alert, despite the hour. "Crystal's been cleaning me out," he said without preamble. Has been for over a year. She's got a man. The line went quiet for exactly 3 seconds. DeAndre could almost see Tanya controlling her expression, holding back 9 years' worth of unspoken thoughts about Crystal. "Tell me what you have," she said finally, her tone shifting to professional precision. DeAndre laid out everything he'd found: the systematic transfers, the hidden accounts, the maxed-out HELOC, Virginia's notary signature. Tanya listened without interrupting, the way she did when reviewing complex contracts. "Don't touch anything else tonight," she said when he finished. "Don't confront her. I'll be there Saturday morning." After hanging up, DeAndre carefully returned every document to its original location. His movements were measured, leaving no trace of his investigation. The dining room table cleared. He climbed the stairs to their bedroom. Crystal was already asleep, her breathing soft and regular. She'd removed her makeup, looking younger in the dim light filtering through the curtains. DeAndre changed into sleep clothes and lay down beside her, as he had every night for 9 years. The ceiling above held no answers as he stared up at it in the darkness. His body remained perfectly still, not even his breathing betraying the weight of what he now knew. The same discipline that made him an exceptional engineer kept him motionless as the night hours crawled past. Wednesday morning arrived with the same rhythm it always did. DeAndre rose at 5:30, his movements quiet and controlled. In the kitchen, he measured coffee grounds with precision, the familiar scent filling the space as hot water dripped through the filter. He heard Crystal's footsteps on the stairs just as he finished pouring 2 cups. She appeared in her silk robe, hair slightly mussed from sleep. DeAndre handed her the coffee. Cream, no sugar, just as she liked it. He kissed her cheek, the gesture as natural as it had been every morning for 9 years. If Crystal noticed anything different in his manner, she gave no sign. She was already scrolling through her phone, half-focused on some social media feed. "Might be late tonight," he said, his voice steady. "Walter wants to review the bridge proposals." Crystal made a non-committal sound, not looking up. DeAndre gathered his things, laptop, blueprints, site jacket, and headed out to his truck. The morning air held the first hint of fall, crisp against his skin. The engineering firm's offices occupied the 3rd floor of a modern glass building downtown. DeAndre rode the elevator in silence, his mind cycling through the sequence of tasks ahead. The weight of 30 sleepless hours sat behind his eyes, but his focus remained sharp. Walter Odom was already at his desk when DeAndre knocked on his office door. The older man looked up, his reading glasses perched on his nose. "DeAndre, early bird as usual. Got a minute?" DeAndre asked, closing the door behind him. Walter gestured to the chair across from his desk. They'd had countless conversations in these same positions over 15 years, discussing projects, reviewing plans, building the kind of professional trust that needed no fanfare. "I want to accept the partnership offer," DeAndre said simply. Walter's eyebrows rose slightly. He removed his glasses, studying DeAndre's face. "You've turned it down twice in 2 years. Said you preferred working directly with the projects, keeping things simple. Circumstances changed." Walter nodded slowly, not pressing for details. That was their way. Professional respect that didn't require personal disclosure. He opened his desk drawer and removed a folder DeAndre recognized. The partnership agreement had been waiting, updated each quarter, for 2 years. "Signing bonus is $90,000, Walter said. "Salary restructure takes effect immediately. We'll need to schedule the formal partner vote, but that's a formality at this point. I'd appreciate it if we could keep the paperwork off the shared HR portal for now," DeAndre said, "until everything's finalized." Walter's eyes sharpened slightly, but he nodded. "Your file, your call." DeAndre signed where indicated, his signature as precise as his blueprints. Walter witnessed each page, then returned the folder to his desk. "Welcome to the next level," he said simply. The First Tennessee Bank branch opened at 9. DeAndre waited in the parking lot, reviewing emails on his phone until the doors unlocked. Inside, he approached the personal banker, who had helped him open his private account 4 years ago. Crystal had been pushing to be added to his retirement accounts back then. He'd opened this account instead. The balance showed $43,000, emergency money he'd set aside in small increments. The banker helped him open a new account. Sole ownership, no joint access. The transfer took less than 5 minutes. At 1 o'clock, DeAndre sat across from Patricia Martinez, a family law attorney whose office overlooked the Mississippi River. He placed 3 folders on her desk: transaction records, HELOC documentation, and the notarized signatures. Patricia reviewed each document methodically, her expression growing more focused with each page. "How long have you known?" she asked, looking up. "Since Tuesday afternoon." She nodded appreciatively. "And you haven't confronted her or indicated you're aware?" "No." "Smart." She tapped the HELOC paperwork. "This is a strong case for dissipation of marital assets. The systematic nature of the transfers, the timing relative to your travel schedule, the involvement of a third-party account holder, that's all documented. The notarized signatures from your mother-in-law add a potential fraud element we can leverage." DeAndre sat quietly, letting her professional assessment wash over him. This was familiar territory, listening to an expert identify structural weaknesses, outline points of failure. Patricia opened her desk drawer and removed a printed checklist. "This is everything we'll need to move forward. Bank statements going back 5 years, credit card records, property deeds, tax returns." She handed him the list. "The more documentation we have, the stronger our position." DeAndre folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his pocket. The sun had begun its late afternoon descent as he walked to his truck, casting long shadows across the parking lot. His body had been awake for over 30 hours, but fatigue felt distant and unimportant. For the first time since Tuesday's discovery, he felt the solid certainty of ground beneath his feet. The way he did when he'd identified a structural flaw and knew exactly how to address it. Saturday morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows as DeAndre methodically laid out documents across the table. Bank statements formed neat rows, credit card bills created precise columns, and the HELOC paperwork occupied its own corner. The house felt different without Crystal's presence. She'd left early for what she called a spa day with friends. The doorbell rang at exactly 9. Tanya Ellison stood on the porch, dressed casually in jeans and a sweater, her laptop bag slung over one shoulder. 20 years of friendship meant she didn't wait for an invitation to set her coffee on the kitchen counter and get to work. "Start from the beginning," she said, pulling out her reading glasses and a legal pad. DeAndre walked her through each document chronologically, his voice steady and factual. Tanya listened without interrupting, her pen moving constantly. When he finished, she began her own review, applying the systematic attention to detail that made her one of the most respected paralegals in Memphis. "Here," she said, after 30 minutes, tapping a bank statement from 8 months ago. "3 transfers you missed. They're buried in the daily transactions, small enough to look like regular spending." She pointed to line items that indeed looked innocuous: $247 at Target, $183 at Kroger, $312 at Macy's. But look at the transaction codes. These weren't purchases. They were transfers to an external account. DeAndre leaned closer, studying the numbers. Tanya was right. The disguised transfers totaled another $742. "She's smart about it," Tanya continued, her voice professional but with an undercurrent of controlled anger. "Never round numbers, never consistent amounts. Spaces them out to avoid automatic flags. This wasn't impulse spending or emotional decisions." She looked up at DeAndre, her eyes sharp. "You know what this is, right? This isn't a woman who fell out of love. This is a woman with a plan." DeAndre nodded once. "I know." Tanya set down her pen and sat back, studying her oldest friend. What do you need from me? You're the only person who knows everything, DeAndre said. I need you to keep it that way until I give the word. Done, Tanya replied without hesitation. What's your next move? For the next few weeks? Nothing changes. I go to work. I come home. I act normal. And that's exactly what he did. For 3 weeks, DeAndre maintained a performance of absolute precision. He made coffee every morning, asked about Crystal's day every evening, kissed her cheek with the same comfortable familiarity they'd built over 9 years. Crystal, reading his continued invisibility as confirmation of it, grew bolder. She came home late on a Tuesday without explanation, her excuse about a workout class transparent in its falseness. The following week, she did it again. Her confidence showed in other ways, too. Casual mentions of investment opportunities she was exploring, subtle probes about whether he'd consider co-signing on new ventures. DeAndre absorbed it all with the same quiet attention he'd always shown. But now, there was purpose behind his silence. Tennessee's one-party consent law meant he could legally record conversations in his own home, as long as he was present. He captured 2 specific exchanges, one in the kitchen where Crystal mentioned money she'd set aside for our future, and another in the living room where she talked about exploring some financial opportunities. Between these performances of normalcy, DeAndre met with a forensic accountant recommended by his attorney. The accountant's office was clinical and precise, much like DeAndre's own workspace. They began the methodical process of tracing every dollar, building a complete picture of 3 years of systematic financial extraction. Late one evening, DeAndre sat in his home office reviewing the accountant's preliminary intake form. The document listed known accounts, suspected transfers, and areas requiring deeper investigation. The house was quiet, except for Crystal's footsteps in the hallway. She appeared in his doorway briefly, dressed for bed in expensive silk pajamas he hadn't seen before. She glanced in, her expression casual, then continued down the hall without speaking. DeAndre watched her go, his face entirely still, the intake form open on his desk illuminated by his desk lamp's soft glow. For a moment, the only sound was the quiet hum of the house's heating system cycling on. DeAndre turned back to his paperwork, his pen moving with the same precise control that had defined every action since that Tuesday afternoon discovery. The intake form required attention to detail. He had always been good at details. The forensic accountant's office occupied a small suite in an East Memphis professional building. DeAndre sat beside Tanya, both of them facing the accountant across her pristine glass desk. The morning sun cast long shadows across stacks of financial documents and spiral-bound reports. The timeline is significantly longer than initially suspected, the accountant began, opening the primary report. We traced the first irregular transfer to 3 years ago, not 14 months. She turned the report toward them, pointing to a highlighted entry. It begins here, 6 months after a $40,000 project bonus was deposited into your joint savings account. DeAndre remembered that bonus clearly. Crystal had been particularly insistent about putting it in their joint savings, arguing it would be good for their future. He'd agreed, thinking her enthusiasm meant shared financial planning. The reality laid out in the report told a different story. The total amount diverted is $162,000, the accountant continued, flipping through meticulously documented transfers. The pattern shows careful spacing and strategic timing. Most notably, she pulled out a calendar overlay. 28 of the larger transfers align precisely with your documented work travel dates. Tanya leaned forward, studying the calendar. She tracked his schedule. Yes, the accountant confirmed. But that's not the most significant finding. She produced a separate folder containing printed email. These were obtained through subpoena of Ms. Brooks's personal email accounts. They revealed direct communication between your wife and Dominic Farrell regarding transfer timing and amounts. DeAndre took the emails, reading them with the same careful attention he gave engineering specifications. Crystal and Dominic had discussed optimal transfer amounts to avoid bank alerts. They had coordinated timing to minimize detection risk. Dominic had explicitly referenced your husband's travel schedule in suggesting windows for larger movements of money. Mr. Farrell was not merely receiving funds, the accountant explained. He was actively directing their extraction and concealment. He acknowledged your existence, your marriage, and participated in designing the fraud structure. What's the legal implication? Tanya asked, her paralegal training focusing immediately on liability. Mr. Farrell's emails transform him from passive beneficiary to active conspirator, the accountant replied. He's exposed to civil action for conspiracy to commit financial fraud and tortious interference with the marital estate. DeAndre absorbed this silently, his engineering mind automatically mapping the structural implications. Each email was a documented connection. Each explicitly acknowledged transfer was a provable act. The system of fraud had its own blueprint, and Dominic had signed his name to it. After the meeting, DeAndre walked Tanya to her car. The parking lot was quiet. Morning traffic humming distantly on Poplar Avenue. He waited until they were alone to make the call she knew was coming. "Walk me through Dominic's exposure," he said simply. Tanya leaned against her car door, laying it out with professional precision. "Civil judgment will be substantial. He'll have to repay his portion of diverted funds plus potential punitive damages. The conspiracy angle opens him to additional penalties, but that's not what will hurt him most." She paused, making sure DeAndre understood the cascade effect. "These emails enter the public record when we file. His development partners will see them. The state licensing board will see them. His entire business model depends on trust and professional reputation. This breaks both." DeAndre nodded once, processing the implications. "Thank you." That evening, sitting in his home office with the forensic report secured in his locked desk drawer, DeAndre made another call. His voice shifted into casual warmth as Jerome Whitfield answered. "Hey, Jerome. Got an extra ticket to the Grizzlies game next Friday if you're interested. Corporate seats, center court." "For real?" Jerome's enthusiasm was genuine. "Man, I haven't been to a game all season. Count me in." They chatted easily about the team's prospects, about Jerome's work, about nothing in particular. DeAndre kept his tone light and friendly, giving no indication that the invitation was anything but spontaneous generosity. When they hung up, he sat for a moment in his quiet office, looking at the phone. The blueprint was taking shape. Each element, the forensic report, the subpoenaed emails, Jerome's involvement, represented a carefully positioned support. The structure would hold. DeAndre had made certain of it. The FedEx Forum hummed with game night energy. DeAndre and Jerome sat in the premium seats, close enough to hear sneakers squeaking on hardwood. They shared nachos and talked easily, like men who'd known each other for years through family connection, but were just now finding their own rhythm. "Man, these seats are something else," Jerome said, shaking his head appreciatively. "Walter hooks you up right. Firm keeps them for client meetings," DeAndre explained. Tonight, they were free. They watched the first quarter, discussing player stats and season prospects. During a timeout, Jerome mentioned his latest construction project, a strip mall renovation in Cordova. The conversation flowed naturally to real estate development. "Mom's actually getting into that space lately," Jerome said, taking a sip of his beer. "She's been talking about some investment group. That developer, Farrell, I think. Dominic Farrell. Says he's got some promising projects coming up." DeAndre kept his expression neutral, but his mind instantly mapped the connection. Virginia Whitfield wasn't just a witness on fraudulent documents. She had a direct financial stake in Dominic's ventures. The web of deception stretched wider than Crystal alone. "Good returns?" DeAndre asked casually. "That's what she says. Though honestly, I don't know much about the guy." Jerome shrugged. "You ever run into him through work?" Names come up once or twice, DeAndre said, focusing on the game resuming below. The following Tuesday, Crystal approached DeAndre in his home office. She wore one of her careful smiles, the kind that never quite reached her eyes. In her hand was a document folder. "Honey, Mom's attorney suggested something smart for estate planning," she said, perching on the edge of his desk. "It's just a quitclaim deed to put the house in both our names equally. Makes things cleaner for the future." DeAndre looked up from his laptop, studying her. 3 years of systematic theft, and still she could stand there, voice warm with false concern about their shared future. He took the folder with a small nod. "I'll take a look," he said simply. "No rush," Crystal replied, touching his shoulder as she left. "Just whenever you have time to review it." The next morning, DeAndre sat in his attorney's office, the quitclaim deed open on the desk between them. The attorney's expression was grim as she explained the implications. "This is calculated," she said, tapping the document. "If you sign this now, it severely undermines our ability to argue dissipation of assets. She's trying to position herself for a forced sale and equal split during divorce proceedings. She thinks I don't know what's coming," DeAndre observed quietly. "There's something else you need to see." The attorney pulled out the complete HELOC application file. "We finally got the full documentation. Look at the stated purpose of funds." DeAndre read the application. Under Purpose of Funds, Crystal had written, "Home renovation and improvement." Attached was a contractor's estimate on professional letterhead. From Martinez Construction, a firm DeAndre had worked with years ago on several engineering projects. "The estimate is forged," the attorney said. "But look at the reference section." There it was, in black and white. DeAndre Brooks, P.E., Senior Project Engineer, followed by his firm's contact information and his professional license number. "She didn't just steal from you," the attorney said quietly. "She used your professional identity and reputation to facilitate the fraud. If this document had been scrutinized at any point during the HELOC process, your engineering credentials could have been investigated." DeAndre stared at his name on the forged document. The betrayal was no longer just financial. Crystal had weaponized his professional reputation, the career he'd built meticulously over decades, to steal from him more effectively. He stood, gathering his coat. "I'll be right back." In the parking lot, DeAndre pulled out his phone. The afternoon sun cast his shadow long across the asphalt as he dialed his attorney's direct line. She answered on the first ring. "File the papers," he said. "Now." Crystal stood in the kitchen, divorce papers trembling in her hands. The morning light through the windows felt harsh, exposing. She had planned to file first, to control the narrative. Now, her carefully constructed timeline lay in ruins. Her fingers fumbled with her phone as she dialed Dominic. He would know what to do. He always knew what to do. The phone rang 3 times before he answered. "I can't really talk right now," Dominic said, his voice clipped and professional. "I'm heading into a meeting." "DeAndre filed for divorce," Crystal said, her voice cracking. "This wasn't supposed to happen yet. We had a plan." A long pause followed. When Dominic spoke again, his tone was measured, distant. "Listen, Crystal. You need to let the lawyers handle this. I've got my attorney working on my end." "Your attorney?" Crystal felt something cold settle in her stomach. "What do you mean, your end?" "Just don't call me about this anymore. Everything needs to go through proper channels now." The warmth she had grown accustomed to, the intimacy they had shared, was completely absent. "I really have to go." The line went dead. Crystal stared at her phone, reality crashing in waves. She dialed again, straight to voicemail. Again, voicemail. Her hands shaking worse now, she called her mother. Virginia arrived 20 minutes later, letting herself in with her spare key. She found Crystal at the kitchen table, the divorce papers spread out before her. "He knows," Crystal said. "He knows everything." Virginia picked up the filing, scanning it with narrowed eyes. This is just initial paperwork. Nothing's decided yet. She sat down beside Crystal, her voice firm. You fight for the house. That's your priority. The equity alone is worth everything. Meanwhile, across town, DeAndre and Tanya sat in his office, assembling a different kind of document package. Tanya handled each paper with practiced precision, organizing them for maximum impact. Start with the HELOC draws, she suggested, sliding the notarized documents forward. Jerome needs to see his mother's signature first. Everything else builds from there. DeAndre nodded, watching as she arranged the subpoenaed emails next. Dozens of exchanges between Crystal and Dominic, discussing transfer amounts and timing. The forensic accountant's summary followed, laying out the full 3-year scope of systematic theft. These go last, Tanya said, placing documentation of Virginia's financial investments in Dominic's development projects at the bottom. Once he sees how deep this goes, he needs to understand his mother wasn't just a witness. She was invested in the outcome. DeAndre took a plain white note card and wrote 8 words in his precise engineer's handwriting. I thought you should know what was done and who was involved. Tanya sealed the package carefully. I'll deliver it myself this afternoon. Better it comes from someone who isn't family. At 2:47 p.m., Tanya walked into the construction management office where Jerome worked. She asked for him by name, handed over the envelope personally, and left without explanation. Jerome, curious about the unexpected delivery, opened it at his desk. He began reading. By 6:15 p.m., Jerome's car idled outside his mother's house in East Memphis. The package lay open across his lap, the final page illuminated by the fading daylight. A detailed accounting of Virginia Whitfield's financial stake in Dominic Farrell's development project. The same man who had guided Crystal through stealing from her husband. The same man his mother had invested with while helping facilitate the fraud. The street was quiet. Sprinklers ticked on manicured lawns. Through the front window, Jerome could see his mother moving around her kitchen, preparing dinner. Unaware, her son sat outside wrestling with the weight of her choices. The documents told a story of calculated betrayal. Not just Crystal's betrayal of her marriage, but his mother's betrayal of basic decency. Virginia hadn't just witnessed fraudulent documents. She had invested in the man helping her daughter steal from DeAndre. She had chosen complicity at every step. Jerome sat there as the sun set, as porch lights began clicking on up and down the street. The truth was a physical presence in the car with him, demanding acknowledgement, demanding action. Finally, he gathered the papers and got out of the car. The walk to his mother's front door felt longer than usual, heavier. Each step carried the weight of what he now knew, what he had to say. He reached the door and rang the bell. Virginia looked up from her cooking as Jerome entered the kitchen. Her smile faded when she saw his expression. Without a word, he laid the document package on her granite countertop, spreading out the papers one by one. "What's all this?" Virginia asked, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Jerome said nothing. He simply pointed to her notarized signature on the HELOC documents, then to the financial records showing her investment in Dominic Farrell's project. The only sound was the soft bubbling of something on the stove. "Jerome," Virginia began, her voice taking on the reasonable tone she'd used throughout his childhood when explaining away uncomfortable truths. "You have to understand. Everything I did was to protect Crystal's future. Protect her future." Jerome's voice was flat. "By helping her steal from her husband?" "That money was as much hers as his," Virginia said, straightening her spine. "She contributed to that marriage, too." "By doing what, exactly?" Jerome asked. "Living in the house he bought? Spending the money he earned while he worked 60-hour weeks?" He tapped the HELOC paperwork. "This is fraud, Mom. You witnessed fraudulent documents. You invested with the same man who helped Crystal drain DeAndre's accounts. Dominic Farrell is a respected businessman. Dominic Farrell helped your daughter systematically steal from her husband for 3 years, Jerome cut in. And you knew. You didn't just know. You helped make it happen. I was protecting my daughter's interests. No. Jerome's voice grew harder. You were helping Crystal betray a man who has shown nothing but respect to this family. A man who worked his way up from nothing, who never once looked down on us, who treated your daughter like a queen. He spread out the email exchanges between Crystal and Dominic. And you helped her steal from him so she could run off with this man. Virginia stared at the documents, her composure cracking slightly. You don't understand? I understand perfectly, Jerome said. I understand that you and Crystal thought you could use DeAndre until something better came along. I understand that you helped facilitate fraud because you never thought he was good enough for this family. He gathered the papers back together. What I don't understand is how you sleep at night. Leaving his mother standing in her kitchen, Jerome drove straight to the house where Crystal was staying. She opened the door looking tired, her makeup perfect, even in distress. You really think I wouldn't find out? Jerome asked, walking past her into the living room. Crystal's eyes fell on the document package in his hands. Jerome, 3 years, Crystal. You spent 3 years stealing from your husband. And Mom helped you do it. It wasn't stealing, Crystal protested. I was unhappy. DeAndre was emotionally unavailable. He cared more about work than... Don't. Jerome's voice could have cut steel. Don't try to make this about DeAndre's failings. The man worked his ass off to give you everything you wanted. And you repaid him by stealing his money and using his professional reputation to commit fraud. I didn't. Jerome pulled out the forged contractor documentation. This has his name on it, his professional credentials. You could have destroyed his entire career. He looked at his sister hard. And for what? For Dominic? The man won't even take your calls now, will he? Crystal flinched. Jerome saw the truth of it in her face. Tell me something, he said quietly. Was any of it real? The marriage? The family dinners? The holidays? Or was DeAndre just a placeholder until something shinier came along? Crystal sat down heavily on her couch. You don't understand. You keep saying that. But I understand perfectly. You and Mom thought you could use DeAndre and discard him when it suited you. You just didn't expect him to be smarter than both of you. The next morning, Jerome sat in his truck outside his office for 10 minutes before making the call. DeAndre answered on the second ring. I'm sorry, Jerome said without preamble. Not for them. They made their choices. I'm sorry because you deserved better from this family. You deserved better than what they did. A long moment of silence followed. Then DeAndre spoke, his voice measured and dignified. The only thing I ever needed from you was the truth, Jerome. You gave me that freely. Later that day, DeAndre recounted the conversation to Tanya over coffee in his office. She listened carefully, her expression thoughtful. Good man, she said simply when he finished. DeAndre nodded. Yes, he is. The courthouse stood stark against the morning sky as DeAndre's attorney opened her presentation with methodical precision. She laid out the forensic accountant's report page by page, her voice steady as she detailed 3 years of systematic transfers. Your Honor, she began, what we have here is not reckless spending or poor communication. This was a calculated effort to dissipate marital assets over an extended period. She displayed the first set of transfers on the courtroom screen. Note the pattern. Transfers consistently timed to Mr. Brooks's documented work travel schedule. Crystal sat beside her attorney, her posture rigid. She wore a conservative black dress, her makeup perfect, but her hands betrayed her tension as they twisted a tissue in her lap. Crystal's attorney stood, adjusting his tie. Your Honor, my client had every right to manage joint marital funds. There was no restriction on these accounts. The judge, a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair, looked up from the documents. Are you suggesting, Counselor, that systematic transfers timed to your client's husband's absence constitute normal asset management? My client was an equal partner in this marriage. Then, perhaps, the judge interrupted, you can explain these emails. She held up the subpoenaed correspondence between Crystal and Dominic Farrell, specifically the ones where Mr. Farrell provides detailed instructions on transfer timing to avoid detection. Crystal's attorney faltered. The judge continued reading. Keep the amounts under $10K and space them at least 8 days apart, she quoted. That's Mr. Farrell writing to your client, is it not? The courtroom fell silent. DeAndre sat perfectly still, his face composed, watching Crystal's careful facade begin to crack. The court finds clear evidence of dissipation of marital assets, the judge declared. The house, held solely in Mr. Brooks's name, is awarded to him without offset. Mrs. Brooks's claim to equity is denied. She looked directly at Crystal. Furthermore, the court orders structured repayment of $162,000 in dissipated funds. As the judgment was read, across town, Dominic Farrell's carefully constructed world was unraveling. The civil suit filing, now public record, had caught the attention of his development partners. The emails, directing Crystal's systematic theft, raised serious questions about his business practices. We need a full audit, Thomas Chen, his largest investment partner, demanded over speakerphone. These emails suggest a pattern of financial manipulation that could extend beyond this incident. Dominic sat in his corner office, watching his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows grow paler. Thomas, this was a personal matter. A personal matter that shows you knowingly facilitated theft of marital assets, Thomas cut in. The State Board has already contacted us about your developer's license review. By afternoon, the Madison Square Partnership, Dominic's largest development project, had formally dissolved. The audit, demanded by his remaining partners, revealed irregularities that prompted further investigation. The civil judgment, when it landed, forced Dominic to return a substantial portion of the transferred funds. His carefully cultivated image of success crumbled as quickly as his projects stalled. Virginia Whitfield faced her own reckoning. Her attorney laid out her exposure bluntly. The notarized HELOC documentation, her signature witnessing fraudulent draws, her financial ties to Dominic's projects. The criminal exposure here is significant, her attorney explained. My strong recommendation is to settle immediately and completely. The settlement, when Virginia signed it, represented most of her retirement savings. Jerome sat with her at the signing, his presence both support and witness to consequences. Crystal sat alone in her rented apartment, staring at her phone. The civil judgment paperwork lay spread across her coffee table, a detailed accounting of everything she'd lost. Her finger hovered over Dominic's number. She pressed dial. It rang once, twice, 3 times, then clicked to voicemail, as it had every time for weeks. She looked around the empty room. No artwork on the walls, no photos, nothing of the life she'd planned. The reality of what she'd been to Dominic settled over her like a heavy blanket. Not a partner, not a future, just a convenient tool for accessing money that wasn't hers. She'd destroyed a loyal marriage for a man who'd used her as efficiently as she'd used DeAndre. The phone slipped from her fingers onto the civil judgment papers. In the silence of her apartment, the truth was deafening. The gravel crunched under the tires of DeAndre's new Ford F-150 as he pulled up to the bridge construction site. Same reliable model he'd always driven, just newer. No chrome, no extras, pure function, like everything else in his life. The sun was just beginning to break over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. He stepped out of the truck, work boots hitting the ground with familiar purpose. The rolled blueprints under his arm contained the latest revisions for the $50 million bridge reconstruction project, the largest contract the firm had handled in its 30-year history. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of fresh concrete and river water. 18 months had rewritten everything, but looking at DeAndre, you wouldn't know it. He wore the same type of work shirt, same steel-toed boots, same quiet focus. The only difference was in his shoulders, a subtle but unmistakable ease that came from standing on ground that was entirely his own. The senior partnership had come with its own office, the kind with a view that Crystal would have loved to brag about at her mother's dinner parties. DeAndre had accepted it without ceremony, the same way he'd accepted Walter's retirement announcement 3 weeks ago. "You're ready," Walter had said simply, and DeAndre had nodded, understanding everything that wasn't being said. His new house sat on the west side of Memphis, smaller than the East Memphis home Crystal had used as leverage, but solid. Clean lines, good bones, no debt. He'd bought it outright, every document bearing only his name. The closing attorney had raised an eyebrow at the cash purchase, but DeAndre had simply signed where indicated. He'd learned the value of owning things completely. Tanya came over most Friday nights now, a routine that had evolved without discussion. She'd arrive with a bottle of wine, usually red, and he'd have something cooking, nothing fancy, just honest food made well. They'd talk about work, about life, about nothing in particular. Sometimes they sat in comfortable silence, the kind that only exists between people who have seen each other's truth and stayed anyway. Last Friday, she'd brought up Crystal for the first time in months. "Heard she's back in Nashville," Tanya had said, not looking up from her glass. DeAndre had nodded, continued stirring the pot of gumbo. The news landed without weight. Crystal's whereabouts were no longer a measurement that mattered in his world. Jerome called regularly, usually on Sunday evenings. Their friendship had grown from the ashes of betrayal into something neither man had expected, a connection built on mutual respect and the shared understanding that doing the right thing often came at a personal cost. They talked about work, about Jerome's kids, about the Grizzlies season. They never talked about Crystal or Virginia. Some chapters didn't need revisiting. DeAndre walked the length of the partially completed bridge deck, his boots leaving temporary marks on the fresh concrete. The river flowed 70 feet below, its current strong and constant. The water didn't care what had happened in the past 18 months. It just kept moving, the way time did, the way life did when you let go of what didn't matter. He thought about the man Crystal thought she'd married, the quiet one, the steady one, the one too focused on structure to notice deception. She'd confused his silence for simplicity, his patience for passivity. She'd never understood that his engineering mind saw everything: load-bearing points, stress fractures, the precise moment when structure would fail. The site foreman approached with a question about the support beam specification. DeAndre opened the plans, explaining the calculations with the same careful precision he'd always used. The foreman nodded, understanding. No one on this site questioned DeAndre's authority or expertise. They saw him exactly as he was. The sun climbed higher, catching the steel reinforcement bars that would soon disappear into concrete. DeAndre moved along the deck, marker in hand, checking measurements against the plans. The river kept flowing below, indifferent to the structure rising above it, indifferent to the man standing on unfinished concrete with plans under his arm. He marked a measurement carefully, checked it twice, moved to the next section, steps sure and unhurried on the raw concrete. There was work to do. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.